For almost a decade, the NCAA banned dunking from its game. In the last half-decade of Wilt Chamberlain's career, the Bill Russell comparisons had died down just to be ignited with a new young center, and for the turbulent times of racial justice in the 60s and 70s, the movement gained a passionate lifelong activist. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was integral to the basketball landscape, from his teens to early 40s. All the while, he kept one eye trained on the outside world. He wasn't an athlete content to simply compete and make a living. He tackled the social injustices in his country and strived to change the status quo. The unblockable hook shot was just a perk. This is a dive into a legend of basketball. So without further ado, it's showtime. Did you see what I did there? That's called foreshadowing, folks. The Showtime era is far down the road for us, though. We're going to need to start on the other side of the country, in the Manhattan neighborhood of Inwood. Born in April 1947, Ferdinand Louis Alcindor Jr. was raised by a police officer / jazz musician father and a seamstress mother. Named after his father, he would live the life of Lou until personally changing his name to Kareem in college and making it public in the pros. He was raised Catholic and attended both church and school dedicated to the religion, an issue that would develop later in life for Kareem and in turn the relationship with his parents. Although even early on, he would have a complicated relationship with his father. Early in his life, the young Kareem was marveling at the world of jazz. He would follow his Juilliard-trained trombonist father to the jazz clubs whenever he could. He was engulfed by the culture and would get introduced to legends such as Miles Davis by his father. After spending a summer with the Harlem Youth Project journalism program, researching the Harlem Renaissance, he soon related to it on an even deeper level. In a later-in-life interview with the Los Angeles Times, Kareem recounted that up until a point in his young life, he said, "Never heard the black voices so clear, so engaging, so vibrant. Their passion to speak their truths gave me the courage to do the same." Toward the end of the Harlem Youth Project, he was able to attend a press conference held by Martin Luther King Jr., and in Kareem's autobiography, On the Shoulder of Giants, he stated that from that moment on, he knew what he had to do with his life. Quote, "I knew that it had to be something that would affect the African American community in a positive way." The passionate voices from both activists and jazz musicians searching for justice continued to shape the high schooler. He began to have a double take on his father's daytime profession. When he was younger, Kareem viewed his dad as a hero of the community. But when he was 17, his opinion was put on its head as he saw the relationship between black protesters and police during the 1964 Harlem riots. He would see police brutality up close, and it shook him to his core. The direct and brutal targeting officers were carrying out against the protesters that he saw as telling nothing but the truth. Just like the old jazz musicians, the relationship between law enforcement and racial advocates has been strained for decades. Abdul-Jabbar had questions swirling around his head constantly, but no one seemed to have the answers, especially someone like his father. In HBO's documentary, Kareem, Minority of One, he talks about how his dad never showed any emotions. He was very wrapped up and hardly said anything. It affected my whole life, because I thought that was why people respected my dad. The man he was named after did not engage with the social side of himself, or with his son, as young Kareem wanted. Another moment of his childhood where he stuck out like a sore thumb. That way was in his personality and viewpoints, though. The major one was how quickly the kid grew. By all unbelievable reports, he was 5 foot 8 inches by the age of 9. I mean, how is that even possible? Was jazz the secret growth formula? By the time he hit 8th grade, he towered at 6 foot 8 inches and was already dunking. This growth trajectory offered the kid a route to basketball dominance, while immediately putting a target on his back. Kareem recounts how he'd often get depressed by all the staring and commenting about his height early on. He led his Catholic high school, Power Memorial Academy, to 3 Catholic school championships and graduate with a 79-2 overall game record. He was nicknamed the Tower from Power, but by the end, he was okay leaving the Power Academy. The fairy tale run he'd take them on was slightly marred at the end by head coach Jack Donahue, referring to him with the N-word. Kareem looks back at that moment and says Donahue was clearly trying to put a fire under him to play harder by saying he was playing lazy and unmotivated like the racial slur would apparently play. But it still crossed the line. The young Kareem walked away from the incident with a new lesson. You never know who would call you that, or who might be having those thoughts in the back of their head. Overall, though, Kareem loved the city of New York and felt a connection to the streets. At the time when it was nearing his press announcer of where he'd attend college, most assumed somewhere nearby, like St. John. Heck, he even did it for most of his time in high school. As he made his way to the academy that day though, and people yelled from their cars or told him in passing on the sidewalk that they hope he stays home. However, the young Alcindor secretly knew he had other plans. This is part of Kareem's story that sees him jet off to UCLA, where he studied history, became entrenched in a new religion, and had a strong connection with John Wooden on their incredible 3-year run. But before we can go there, we quickly need to go over the first budding relationship the young kid had with a big-time name. Back at the age of 15, Abdul Jabbar was closing in on his 7'1" stature and New York basketball celebrity status. It would just so happen that year he also met one Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt was a basketball celebrity on a whole different level. After their brief encounter at Rucker Park, Wilt took a liking to the kid. Whether Chamberlain liked the idea of having a protege or just thought it was fun having the kid around, he took the young Kareem under his wing and showed him a lifestyle of jazz clubs, horse races, and the revolving door of Wilt's relationship status. His first ever crush may or may not have been one of Chamberlain's many girlfriends. This mentor and apprentice relationship was incredibly exciting for the kid, but it was already showing the future lines that would divide them. Wilt could be a little aggressive when it came to everyday life. Once he and Kareem were in the elevator, and a man walked in and tried the age-old joke, "How's the weather up there?" Wilt turned to him and spit on the man, and said, "It's raining." This was not the way of the world the lanky teenager was used to operating in. He was a much more intrinsic, sensitive personality that would have very much rather ignored the man than engaged. And as Abdul Jabbar continued to dive into black pride, the cracks with his hero would soon become too big to cross. We'll circle back to these two later on. For now, let's land in Los Angeles, California. Finally out from the watching eyes of a Southern mother and a stern law enforcement father, the basketball phenom was ready to have some fun out in the sun. It was the mid-60s, and everyone wanted to know the giant from the Big Apple. He was still the sensitive and inward-facing character, but he was now experiencing the nightlife and parties of the college years. College teammates even talk about how much of a ladies' man Kareem was back then, almost like he had finally processed everything he had heard from the suave Chamberlain. But none of this distracted the college student from his goals. His first year of UCLA would have to be spent on the freshman basketball team. Having dominated an entire state in the game, you would expect someone of his caliber might be annoyed and disgruntled at the idea of not immediately jumping to varsity. It's what he did in high school. But instead, the 7-footer had no problem complying with the NCAA rules about freshman play. Overall, he was just happy to be with someone like legendary coach John Wooden. Right away, the two hit it off. The reserved and ever humble Wooden was raised in the farmlands of Indiana. Even with his unrivaled success coaching UCLA, he never let any achievement go to his head. After growing up with a father like Kareem did, he found those qualities very comforting and knew how to operate within them. And all the while, Wooden made an effort to try and understand the life the African-American star was enduring. He would hear the nasty comments being thrown out at the soon-to-be Kareem. The racist undertones of America were magnified with as large of a figure as his new star player. But nevertheless, freshman year began, and Kareem was ready to battle. It started with an exhibition game in 1965 against the varsity squad. UCLA was just coming off a championship run and was expecting to have an easy start to the season. But then something completely unexpected happened. They lost to the freshman, aka they lost to Kareem. Right away, he was unstoppable at the next level. During this breeze through freshman basketball competition, Abdul Jabbar became fascinated by the autobiography of Muslim minister and civil rights activist Malcolm X, and a string of events started all getting connected for Kareem. After witnessing the Harlem riots and police brutality, after seeing more police attacks against the peaceful protests led by MLK, and then the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, and reading his story the following year, these moments started to come together with Kareem's big question throughout his teen years: how will he be a part of the movement? His life changed after seeing King's press conference in person, and now it felt like it was a chance to start taking action. All of high school and his first year at UCLA, he was basically prohibited from speaking to the press, so his voice was not necessarily being heard about any of these important issues he was pondering. It would also begin the snowballing of his standoffish relationship with the press, and his label as an overly serious and uncooperative personality. He'd find action, however, in joining the UCLA rallies against the Vietnam War. And then, by his sophomore year, he'd start engaging with the public much more, with his thoughts and ideas about America and religion. Because after all the readings of Malcolm X piqued his interest in Islam, he dedicated his time to studying the religion. Kareem grew up Catholic, sure, but after a while, he felt alienated and disgusted with the past history of the church's connection with slavery. By 1968, he converted to Islam. Gone were the days of Catholicism and Lou Alcindor. He was, at least in private, now called Noble One, servant of the Almighty, aka Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. While Kareem was battling with racism and civil rights in his early 20s, he soon found it even leaching into the other half of his world, basketball. In 1967, the NCAA made a questionably motivated rule change to ban the dunk. They cited injury concerns for players and that it was not a skillful basketball play. Critics openly pointed out that not a lot of players were dunking at the time, let alone getting injured. Players that were dunking consistently were African American, and most clearly, star athlete Lou Alcindor. It was a rule with racial undertones that the star was all too familiar with feeling, but game-wise, it clearly didn't matter. He'd get to play varsity in his sophomore year, and the Bruins went on a 3-year championship run where he won 3 National Player of the Year awards. Wooden and Kareem made a dynamic coach-player duo that totaled out to 88 wins and 2 losses. After losing his dunking, Kareem focused on his post moves. He'd been practicing hook shots from a very early age, as his height made it clear he would be a center for life. The NCAA forced him to lean on it even harder now, thus birthing the creation of the unblockable shot, the skyhook. A shot that was so simple, so efficient, it didn't matter what the defenders did. Kareem was putting on arguably the best college career in history. And even if you're keeping track at home, that's 4 losses in all of high school and college. He had only played a game of basketball where he had lost 4 separate times. That same year, Kareem expanded his game with the banning of the dunk. It was the same year he took a huge leap in his civil rights life as well. 1967 saw the Cleveland Summit, held by multiple African American athletes, to show support for Muhammad Ali's fight against being drafted into the Vietnam War. It featured many pro football players and NBA legend Bill Russell, and there for it all, to help discuss and learn from everyone, was a young Kareem. This could be looked back on as the moment Jabbar made it clear, on the national level, where his feelings lie. He witnessed the unbreakable will of Muhammad Ali, and viewed the whole experience as another turning point in his life. He didn't need to worry about what other people said about him anymore. He thought what he thought, and wouldn't stifle at opposition. So later that year, when the 1968 Olympic team selections were taking place, Kareem teamed up with college track stars Tommy Smith and Lee Evans to refuse participation. When the Olympics came and went in Mexico City, Kareem wasn't there. He explained that his motivation was, quote, trying to point out to the world the futility of winning the gold medal for this country and then coming back to live under oppression. The young activist was not going to help celebrate a country that was not celebrating an entire race. His opinions and actions were starting to make mainstream America uncomfortable as it continued to refuse to look inward at itself, just as Kareem had been doing all his life. Nonetheless, Kareem powered through college and graduated with his degree in history and declared for the NBA draft. His approval ratings might have started to look a bit iffy, but his basketball skill was unshakable. As the clear-cut #1 overall pick, it came down to a simple coin flip between the Phoenix Suns and Milwaukee Bucks. Both teams were only a year old, and so by far the worst in the league. The Suns called heads, but tails never fails. Kareem was headed to Wisconsin, which in Kareem's eyes was fine. He grew up in New York, so he suddenly didn't forget what winter was like during his time in LA. But Milwaukee was no metropolis on either coast of the country. It was a Midwest city, greatly lacking in diversity, a trait Jabbar noticed almost immediately. He was a good soldier though, and played on, even if the lifestyle was away from everything he had known. In Kareem's rookie season, he averaged almost 29 points and 15 rebounds. He was the obvious Rookie of the Year, as well as gaining his first All-Star selection of 19 total. He turned the newly founded Bucks completely around, going from 27 to 56 wins. It was already showing no one could stop the big man, but Milwaukee still had a glaring weakness that stunned their championship hopes. The backcourt was bad. Their starting point guard was Flynn Robinson, who averaged just 1 more assist than their team's center. Keep in mind, this wasn't the time of Nikola Jokic-like playmaking. Kareem was averaging 4.4 assists a game, which was a lot for a center at the time. One other big man that was racing the floor of playmaking centers was former mentor Wilt Chamberlain, who by the 70s was now out from under the thumb of constantly being compared to Bill Russell, but was now getting immediately shoved back under another player. This time, it was Kareem. so the team needed a point guard as they headed into Jabbar's second season. They wanted one of the top playmakers in the league. They looked out west and got the Big O, Oscar Robertson. It was a pairing of a 23-year-old center and a 31-year-old point guard. To no surprise, when the team told Kareem who they were getting for him, he responded with, "He's kinda old, isn't he?" The age gap didn't seem to matter once the duo got their feet under them though. After an acclimation period, they found their groove and dominated the regular season, finishing 66-16. Kareem averaged 32 points and 16 rebounds. In his second year of the NBA, he won the regular season MVP. And as the pairing headed into the playoffs, one thing was on both of their minds: a championship. For Robertson, he had done it all in his career. A former MVP and 10-time All-Star, the only thing he received criticism for was the lack of a title. This was his final chance. And for Kareem, hey, he was used to losing 1 or 2 games tops an entire season. He expected excellence every time he stepped on the court, and to be able to outplay any and all opponents. The Bucks made it to the finals and swept the Washington Bullets. They won the 1971 Finals, and Kareem walked away with Finals MVP, his last NBA award, as Lou Alcindor. In that offseason, he was ready to announce his Islamic transformation. Speculation says he might have felt he finally had enough of a voice in the American landscape after just winning the NBA Finals, that it could lead to an easier and more accepted transition. But going from a Catholic name to a Muslim in the heart of the country was a tough pill for many to swallow. Even outside of the heavily white Midwest, Islam was viewed as a very un-American religion in the USA of the 70s. He was bombarded with questions from reporters and unaccepting white fans. It was even a shock for his family. As mentioned earlier, Kareem just didn't have a Catholic name. He was raised heavily inside that religion by his parents. But to Kareem, carrying the name of the French planter in the West Indies, who owned my ancestors, was dishonoring those actual members of his lineage. Slowly but surely, people started to accept the new name. It seemed to go down a little smoother than when someone like Muhammad Ali announced his devotion to becoming a black Muslim. Kareem had a much softer way of speaking and dove into the intricacies of it with reporters at the time. He said, quote, "The adoption of a new name was an extension of my rejection to all things in my life that related to the enslavement of my family and people." He was moving on and becoming his own man. When Kareem looks back on the announcement now, he admits it wasn't perfect and wishes he did some things differently. He talks about how he viewed this as a very personal journey to changing his name. But because he was continually trying to add his voice to the civil rights movements of the day, it got twisted up into more politics and religious denouncement than he would have liked. The coming years of Milwaukee were quite turbulent outside of just the name change. Part of Kareem's conversion into the world of Islam was wrapped up with Hamas Abdul Khalis, a former leader in the Black Muslim organization, who is now creating his own much smaller anti-group, the Hanafi movement. With Jabbar as his big-name member, they used his funds to buy a house in DC and set up base camp. Hamas made it a point to run as much of the lives of his followers as he could. This showed through in ways such as Kareem's relationship with his soon-to-be wife, Janice Brown. Once Brown converted to Islam as well, people noted going over to the couple's house and noticing that she needed to ask permission to enter rooms, or to do things such as taste the food before the men. It all peaked when Hamas banned both sets of parents from their wedding because they were not Muslims. This created a fault line within the foundation of Kareem and his parents' relationship, one that had to be reconciled over time down the road. In the HBO documentary, Kareem, Minority of One, he recounts how the worst thing Hamas did for his followers was that of self-isolation. He divided them from everybody, even their families. Kareem said there was a feeling of us against the world, even though he later learned did not ever have to be the case. In 1973, Hamas verbally attacked the Black Muslim movement, and the group retaliated. A section of the group broke into the DC house Kareem bought and shot and killed 6 members of the Hanafi. Kareem was in Milwaukee at the time and flew back for the funerals. It caused every member of the group to fear for their lives, including Jabbar. Back in Milwaukee, the locker room was suddenly very tense. They had FBI and other government entities constantly guarding the team, plus the Bucks hiring their own security. The team was supposed to be a continuous contender, but was now embroiled in controversy, and they feared for their lives. That year, Kareem still didn't waver from his devotion to Islam. He traveled to the Middle East to learn Arabic and study the Quran. On his way back, he thought he'd stop by Hong Kong to see an unusual close friend, Bruce Lee. It turns out that while all this basketball, activism, and religious activity was taking place, Kareem had another love: martial arts. He met and trained with Bruce for 4 years and did a cameo fighting Lee in the movie Game of Death. The two found respect in each other's passion for their crafts and were hoping to reconnect in that 1973 visit. Unfortunately, before Kareem could board a plane to fly over, he saw the news that Bruce Lee had died. He was just 32. After multiple losses in Kareem's life and the continued controversy with the Hanabi, things were looking dim. Not to mention, the championship window had been practically boarded up. Kareem earned his third MVP award in 1974, but lost in the finals to the Boston Celtics. Oscar retired after that season, and the following year found the Bucks at the bottom of the league. This was the first time Jabbar had ever been on a losing team. It was all swirling around him, and he wanted to go back somewhere he loved, somewhere he could relax. All right, we're finally here. It's showtime. It was 1975, and Kareem was 28 years old. Typically, that meant an NBA player would be around the peak of their powers. But for someone like Jabbar, it seemed like he had already hit, and been holding his prime this entire time. Also, the man always acted and talked way older than he actually was. With everything that had just happened to him outside of basketball, Kareem seemed older than you would expect. The media disdain snowball he started back in early college, and by now was a large boulder. He was getting labels thrown at him from every angle, talking about his uncooperativeness, over-seriousness, that he's Mr. Gump Kareem. Puts it bluntly that he was being portrayed as the typical brooding black guy. In reality, he has been a very shy person all his life, and had just grown tired of playing the game. His delivery of short answers was many times the honest way he would answer in a situation like a press conference. This was what the first few years of Lakers basketball were. Kareem was brilliant, but also continued to stay to himself and enjoy the LA weather. Little did we know, he was about to get a major rebrand in more ways than one. In 1980, the hit comedy movie Airplane came out in theaters. Jabbar did another movie cameo and played a pilot. The scene was a comedic take on all the criticism Kareem has received about his game during that time. It allowed audiences to realize this guy didn't take himself that seriously. He was able to joke about this stuff to the level of being pulled out of a cockpit wearing his game shorts. Fans started to come back around to the 7-footer with a dry sense of humor. And that, coupled with his new teammate, honestly, Kareem didn't have a choice but to bring out his lighter side. Magic Johnson was drafted in 1979 and was already coming in as a huge Abdul Jabbar fan. He recounts how ecstatic he was to be his rookie. He did stuff like bring Kareem Gatorade whenever he wanted and drop his mail off to him every day. Anything to absorb and learn from one of the greats. And under new head coach Pat Riley, the new fast-paced duo had a bring out the best in each other relationship. As Magic brought out Kareem's smile while the center kept Johnson grounded, it was the first Lakers win with Magic and Kareem. And as the Lakers hit the winning shot, the rookie point guard sprinted to Kareem and jumped into his arms. Jabbar admired the exuberance but calmed him down and reminded him to cool down. It's a long season. He let Magic take the reins as the vocal leader and began to fade into the number 2 role as his 30s progressed. In Magic's first year, they went to the 1979-1980 finals and beat the 76ers. It was the first trip to the finals for the Lakers in almost a decade. It was Kareem's second championship and 6th regular season MVP year, becoming the player with the most in NBA history to this day. While the Showtime Lakers were starting to have their way with the league, Kareem met a new love interest off the court. He and his wife divorced in 1978, and he very soon after started a relationship with Cheryl Pistono. The two of them would never technically marry, but had a strong relationship, along with Kareem's 4th child, Amir. Amir gave Kareem the realization of his past fatherly struggles. Now that he was approaching his mid-30s, he felt the aching need to spend as much time as he could with his new son. But back in his earlier days, with the first 3 kids, he was so wrapped up in his professional game and the Hanafi groups, he felt he didn't give them the father they needed. He often joked about almost being like an uncle-dad because of his sporadic involvement. Cheryl helped turn Kareem's personal life in more ways than just that. She knew he belonged with his family and secretly flew out to his parents to try and reconcile everything that happened in the past. After the wedding banishment, Kareem and his parents soon lost touch overall. But now they were in LA, and Kareem realized the hard lines to try and rebuild his family. From that point on, he was reunited with his softer side, a family man that missed his parents and wanted to give the best for his children. As the 80s continued on, Kareem started to slow down. He was the old head in the locker room and could be seen with his head buried in a book, while the younger guys constantly joked. After all his own battles with greats, he found himself back in a pivotal time in NBA history. But this time, he was true to his airplane character and acted as the co-pilot. The 80s were dominated by Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird headlines. Jabbar was still integral to the Lakers, but Magic was clearly the guy now. Though you'd imagine for the shy superstar, this was no problem at all. In 1984, he did grab the spotlight back for a night. He was less than 25 points away from passing good old Wilt Chamberlain for the all-time scoring title, nearly 2 decades after they first met back in Rucker Park. The lanky 15-year-old boy was about to overtake the man that gave him his worn-out smelly suits back then. Kareem may look back at his relationship with Wilt as an overall fond one in moments, but during this passing, and the years afterward, there was no denying the distaste for one another. Wilt, it seemed, had become flat-out jealous of his overtaking by Kareem, and was doing his best to put him back down. He'd made comments about his game, his defense, and his character. He said, "I named my dog Kareem, but I spell it with a C, because my dog has a heart." What? Wilt, that's just a weird one, man. Congrats on Kareem, though. I bet it's a great dog. They also went back and forth on their respective autobiography books, attacking each other, but overall got nowhere. Eventually, the attacks died down as both aged into retirement. His idol growing up had turned into his biggest hater, and in the end, landed in the middle, on at least decent terms. After that, Kareem continued to average over 20 points until he turned 39 years old. The Lakers won 4 more rings during the run, and then in the final season of the decade, the NBA's leading scorer of all time announced his farewell tour. He was 41 years old in his last run, his 20th year in the NBA. He had 6 MVPs and 6 rings to shine as he went out. By this time, fans weren't talking about the old controversies. They weren't booing him for being a Muslim or being closed off. No more racial slurs being thrown out. His farewell tour met with gifts at each arena, with a standing ovation. Even after a decade of battling Boston, they gave him a big speech and applause. Everyone was happy. Well, except Wilt. He thought the gifts were over the top, and Kareem should have made donations to charity instead. He didn't get gifts when he retired. Sorry, Wilt, go take Kareem for a walk. In his final game in LA, Kareem walked onto the court to give a speech. He was grabbing a mic to thank the crowd and fans from all across the world for believing in him, for following him through all the ups and downs of life. Most importantly, he wanted to thank his parents. Quote, "When your dad is a cop and your mom believes in what's right, they set exacting standards for you, and I tried to live up to them. And they did it with a lot of love and a lot of patience." He ended it with, "I love you all, thank you very much." In the 34 years Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has been retired from the game of basketball, his shyness has not deterred him from remaining a public figure. He spent his years writing and continuing to focus on activism. He finally doesn't have to live the exhausting dual life of superstar athlete and social justice activist. He's focused on the thing that's meant more to him beyond competition. He passed down the all-time scorer mantle to LeBron James and moved on. He's had health battles with both leukemia and prostate cancer, but has still been able to live a fulfilling life with his writing, yoga, and children. As we zoom out now and say goodbye to the story of Kareem, what do we see? A young boy that grew up in a harsh time, surrounded by police brutality and racial injustice. He managed to find solace in the beautiful world of jazz, and would get lost in albums with his quiet father. We can see a teenager and early 20s Kareem wrestling with his identity while not letting anything distract him from the real issues of America, even if that meant ruffling feathers or turning off the media. Milwaukee was cold as he started to turn off the warmth from his family, and a reconnection in the last half of his career brought him back to more than just the palm trees. It's a story about how no matter what, stay passionate. Even if that fire can lead you astray, it can also lead you right back home.